Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Welcome everybody to episode 10 of Espresso Martini with myself, Chris Carr, and Matt Fulton. Matt, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, Chris. How are you? Good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. We're doing well. Did you know that the number 10 is a symbol of success and achievement? Did you know that?
Is it really? I didn't know that. Well, it's a good, solid, rounded number.
It is.
I can see that. That makes sense.
So I thought it was pretty cool today. So I thought today is, today, as we sort of been discussing, is a day of new beginnings. So maybe picking episode 10 to do it was fortuitous of us. Today we're launching an extra show that will be a Patreon exclusive, and it will follow immediately after this episode. And that new show is called Extra Shot. And it will give us an opportunity to talk about the stories that we didn't cover, but we really wanted to. And also we may talk about stories or bits of history that are on our mind at the moment. And in time, we also plan to get on the odd guest and hopefully even some listeners. So to get access to Extra Shot, you'll need to be a Patreon subscriber. So go to patreon.com/secrets and spies, and you'll need to pick a subscription level. Depending on which level you select, you'll get either a complimentary coffee cup or a set of coasters. So I hope all that sounds like good value to you. You'll be directly supporting this podcast, and if it becomes popular, we'll be open to expanding and making more content exclusively for you. I just also want to say a huge thank you to our listeners who are currently supporting us on Patreon, and I hope this is the start of an exciting new chapter for us in making more content for you. So today we have another jam-packed episode. We're going to be looking at a few interesting stories that have caught our eye in the world of espionage, geopolitics, and intrigue, which is our area, especially intrigue. So today we're going to start with a letter that was posted in the Daily Telegraph about the fall of Bakhmut in Ukraine. The author of this letter is a retired colonel named Hamish de Breton Gordon, what a name, and he was in the British Army for 23 years, and he was a commanding officer in the UK's Radiological and Nuclear Regiment, and also NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion. So quite an interesting background there. So what I'll do, I'll just go through the details of the article, and then Matt, I'll come to you for any thoughts. So the letter is titled, "Putin is toast without Bakhmut." And it was published in the Daily Telegraph. Not necessarily my favourite paper, but once in a while has a good one. So the key points of the article: the fall of Bakhmut has sparked debate and concern in the West. Putin's sudden claim for victory is a response to recent political setbacks back in Russia. Zelensky's visits to the G7 and the Arab summit in Jeddah has garnered sympathy and support for Ukraine. India's Prime Minister Modi lamented the human cost of the war and said far more than many expected him to. And he also said that he's committed to finding a way forward to the end of the conflict, and his remarks were kind of seen as hardly those of a great friend of Vladimir Putin, because Modi has been seen as very close to Putin in recent years. President Biden's decision to allow European countries to provide F-16s to Ukraine is a significant blow to Russia's chances of victory. The author believes it actually hammered the final nail in the coffin for Russian victory in Ukraine, so that may be positive for Ukraine now, fingers crossed. The F-16s will provide air superiority and act as a powerful deterrent against a future Russian invasion. And calls for greater military support have been obviously ongoing. The supplied tanks and air defense assets have proved vital for Ukraine in its ongoing defense against Russian forces, particularly long-range precision artillery and HIMARS. The availability of these military assets earlier could have led to a decisive Ukrainian victory and deterred Putin from invading. Putin's nuclear threats, ground assaults, and air force have all so far failed. And the author notes that failed tyrants tend not to last long in similar circumstances. So, Matt, what are your thoughts on that letter?
I thought it was a very good and salient point. I mean, this article really kind of touches on so the apparent fall of Bakhmut, very much sort of a Pyrrhic victory for Wagner and the Russians. But on top of that, and the news that the U.S. sort of gave the green light for the Europeans to sell F-16s to the Ukrainians. I think recently there's just been a lot of really positive developments. It came out of the last week. You had Zelensky kind of doing a world tour. I mean, he showed up at the Arab League summit in Jeddah, which, I mean, I think it's kind of, one can make the argument that it's particularly kind of gross that Zelensky had to go and speak to this at this summit where, you know, it was the first time that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, had attended in over a decade, I think, since the start of the civil war. You know, speaking to a body that includes a country that, you know, for the last decade or so has been pretty much exclusively propped up by the Russians, the Wagner group, specifically committing, you know, war crimes in Bashar al-Assad's name. So that's pretty gross. And then, you know, jetted off to Hiroshima, to the G7 summit in Japan. Yeah, I think it's positive that Zelensky went and made these points to the Arabs himself in person. You know, I mean, recently Mohammed bin Salman, who's, you know, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, kind of like the de facto leader of the Arab League at this point, has played kind of a, unfortunately for us, has played kind of a middle ground between, you know, the U.S. that has traditionally been Saudi Arabia's main benefactor and ally, you know, since the beginning of the post-war order. You know, has sort of, you know, playing that middle ground between the U.S. and now the sort of authoritarian axis that we've talked about on here a lot, led by, you know, the Russia and China. You know, I guess his sort of stance now is that Saudi Arabia isn't going to be entirely kind of beholden to the U.S. as a client state so much, you know. So I think it's good that Zelensky has this personal face-to-face relationship with these Arab leaders who can, I mean, give the Ukrainians a lot, by not lending support to the Russians. At least they can help a lot by just not doing anything. And, you know, B, after this war is over, eventually, you know, their investments can do a lot to rebuild Ukraine after this is all over. And yeah, I think it's beneficial that Zelensky has this personal relationship with the Arabs so that it doesn't have to go entirely through Washington. I think that's good. I think you saw a lot of good signals out of Narendra Modi, you know, who was a guest at the G7 summit, who's, you know, another one. I think, yeah, India just passed China as the world's most populous country. So, you know, you have these two kind of big rising powers in the 21st century, and I think it's good to see signals that they're willing to play ball with the Ukrainians a bit.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, just speaking widely, Middle Eastern, African, and some Asian countries have been a bit sort of ambivalent about Russia's war on Ukraine. So I think Zelensky's playing to his superpower, which is, you know, he's very good at kind of going out and physically meeting with people and kind of, I say win them over. I don't mean that necessarily as a negative. I see that as a positive. But he's very good at sort of touching people with his words. I think he's got a real sort of superpower there. And obviously got a great team of researchers and probably sort of speech writers with him as well who aid him in that effort. But he's very good at sort of finding the kind of cultural touch points that kind of sing to his audience, I think, or mean something to his audience. And I think he's very good at that.
There's never really been, to my knowledge, an audience that he's faced that has rejected him.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And I think that's really, you know, to his credit. I mean, he came here to Washington, gave addressed a joint session of Congress that went really well, and I think very wisely went out of his way to build relationships with Republicans in Congress.
Yeah,
which, you know, as you know, could create all kinds of issues for him with the, you know, support that the Biden administration has been giving to Ukraine. If it becomes a hard black and white partisan issue here, that, you know, Republicans are like, no, we're not going to support Ukraine. So I think it's good that that he's developed those relationships. I mean, he's really set himself up as kind of like the avatar of the Western world right now, which is odd because, I mean, you wouldn't really, until this war, I don't think most people would have considered Ukraine part of the Western world. Very much still in the shadow of the Soviet Union. And one more thing, you mentioned South Africa too. They've had kind of problematic leanings toward the Russians in recent years. Are you familiar with the? It's a very kind of a hyper local reason for this. Are you familiar with the role that the Soviets played during apartheid?
Not massively, but feel free to kind of tell us a bit more.
So back then, in the worst of apartheid rule in South Africa, the Soviets were one of the biggest champions against that. Seeing it, as sort of like an anti-Western, anti-colonialist, very classically left stance. But yeah, they were some of the biggest champions against apartheid South Africa, and now many of the people who run South Africa, were sort of directly involved in that struggle and have kind of I think positive views of the Russians from that time. They feel that they owe the Russians something. I mean, that was the same during the Libyan civil war. The South Africans were very supportive of, or at least nominally supportive of, Gaddafi, or at least they weren't vocally against Gaddafi for the same reasons. Gaddafi was very much anti-apartheid back then in the 80s and such. So it's interesting to see how these sort of small regional issues that I think most of us would consider to be like gone and in the past still kind of rear their heads in these modern conflicts.
Well, it's interesting actually you mention it, because it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Western, certain aspects of the Western's left's problematic sort of relationship with Russia. You kind of get these sort of figures in British politics who just seem to be a little bit pro-Putin, and you do wonder if it's because of this sort of nostalgia for what the Soviet Union was and the causes it was sort of, it's sort of supposedly supported and so on.
Right. Well, I think the UK also has a much stronger history of trade unionism. Especially in the working class, the North, the traditional red labor law that, I think lends itself to that sort of classic idea of a communist utopia, a workers' paradise, as it was, which, that's what people thought the Soviet Union was. And for a lot of people, it was. I mean, if you go around and do surveys of a lot of the post-Soviet space, parts of rural and far eastern Russia, parts of Central Asia. I mean, there's a lot of people who will straight up tell you, yeah, we had it better back then. And they're not wrong.
I know in Yugoslavia they felt that way.
Yeah.
What was Yugoslavia? Yeah, because they're friends who survived the Bosnian War, and my friend's mother used to have a real sort of rosy-eyed view of the past, which was understandable considering she then faced genocide once they lost their Soviet backing. So one other thing that sort of popped, well, a few other things that popped into my mind with this article. So the author mentions how Putin's nuclear threats and air force have sort of so far failed. And I felt like there's been this sort of argument I've seen for a while where people are saying that we shouldn't take Putin's sort of nuclear threats that seriously. We should have gone in and armed Ukraine with everything from day one. And I kind of understand that, but at the same time, I find this sort of slight dismissiveness of nuclear threats a bit problematic for me. I kind of feel like the approach that the West has taken, or should I say the US and NATO have taken so far, and that kind of gradual approach is probably, I think, kind of the wiser approach. If they'd gone in from day one with F-16s, etc., I think things could have boiled over very dramatically and very fast. Obviously, this sort of step-by-step or incremental approach has cost many Ukrainian lives. We can't deny that. But ultimately, I put the blame of that loss of life still with Russia, who are the aggressor. I also think you and I share a concern about what happens next in Russia, because, the loss of Ukraine does spell the end for Putin. What does that mean for Russia? There's been some talk recently and in the past of tensions among Putin's inner circle, and we certainly recently have, just yesterday, Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, he's been vocally quite critical of the Russian leadership, as he puts it, of handling the war. And he said just yesterday that Moscow's plan to demilitarize Ukraine of its full-scale invasion has failed, instead turning its neighbour's army into one of the most powerful in the world. And I quite enjoyed that description of Ukraine. And setting Russia up for a possible uprising. And he's even gone far as saying that there may be a revolution if leadership does not improve its handling of the war. And that's an interesting comment coming from Prigozhin. And I know some people in the past have sort of seen him as a potential successor or rival to Putin. And was it a while back he was threatening to withdraw from Bakhmut, wasn't he, just only weeks ago?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of...
He was running out of ammunition, and he like, called out the general staff, the defense minister, like by name, and said, like, I'm going to pull out if you don't give me ammunition. And they did.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, it's such a... I don't know. I mean, when you think about the American and British wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think you ever had anybody publicly kind of calling out Bush or anybody in quite that way and stuff. I don't know. It's an interesting one.
It's a good point that you make about the arms shipments that we've been giving them. I think a lot of people also don't understand this. There's a criticism in the U.S. at least, like, oh, we're spending all this money on the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, they're not, we have homeless issues and issues with the borders and stuff here. I mean, we've talked about this before. It's a fraction of our defense budget that we're using to shred the Russian military apart. It's a great return on investment. And what I think a lot of people don't realize, we're not just transferring them like huge. We're not transferring the Ukrainians huge sums of cash. We're buying. The Pentagon is buying or are buying these weapons and equipment from U.S. defense contractors, right? Starting up assembly lines in the U.S., providing jobs to U.S. workers. Keeping the iron hot as it is, producing a lot of this equipment that, isn't manufactured much, and then sending it over to the Ukrainians. So we're not paying the Ukrainians, we're paying U.S. companies and U.S. workers to manufacture this stuff.
Yeah.
And then giving it to the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very false argument to say that, like, we're just, just shoving them like fistfuls of cash.
Well, yeah, I think I saw somewhere that there were some people, because I know I'm quite familiar with the criticisms from the Republicans against arming Ukraine now. It's sort of almost got a bit boring watching the Republicans, but I did notice there was some stuff from the left, potentially AOC, who obviously who is a much, she's sort of loved in some circles of the left and absolutely despised on the right. I feel a bit middle ground about AOC. I think she's pretty good on some things and a bit odd on others, and I believe she's was becoming kind of critical of arming Ukraine, or at least giving military support, and it might have been under that misunderstanding that it's America just giving out money, and I think, I don't know whether she would see weapons manufacturing as a positive. I don't know. It's an interesting one. I don't know if you've got any insight on any leftist voices that have been a bit critical of the war.
I have a few friends of mine who are, I mean, most of my social circle is pretty progressive. I have a few friends who are quite, I think they're not, like militantly against it. I mean, they're not pro Russian, but I think they are skeptical of it for those same reasons. I mean, yeah, I'm sort of with you in the same place with AOC. I agree with a lot of what she says, not everything, especially not this. I mean, I think that aside, she's one of the most effective political communicators of her generation, whether you like her or not.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see like how far the debate has come. I mean, I remember even like just before the invasion and like right after it, like the Germans were like, we'll send you helmets and MREs, to the Ukrainians, and then it got to be like the HIMARS and artillery, and like the Ukrainians asked for it and we said no. Then eventually we gave it to them. And then they asked for, what was it? Tanks, and we said no. And then we gave it to them. And then they asked for F-16s and we said no. And then we gave it to them, so
it's a bit like some weird parenting book somebody's been reading.
Yeah. It's become kind of like a weird running joke now, but to your point earlier, I don't think it would have been wise to just, whatever the Ukrainians want, as soon as they ask for it, we just give it to them, no questions asked. I mean, I think that's a popular position that a lot of, people on Twitter have, and I think they're coming at it from the right place, but Russia is a nuclear power, comparable only to the United States in terms of, what it can do with its arsenal. And it is serious. And I think it's, while it's good and right that we're giving the Ukrainians everything they need to, beat the shit out of these fascist monsters. I think it is right to have a bit of caution and to do this responsibly, and to, make sure that the Ukrainians, that their air crews are able to, appropriately handle these very complex weapon systems. At the same time, I, reject a lot of the arguments you see on sort of the kook fringes on the right and the left that, because the Russians have nuclear weapons that, we can't do anything. We just have to let them do whatever they want. I mean, at that point, you're just giving yourself up to like extortion. Like, okay, if the new doctrine is of the 21st century is, okay, if a country has a nuclear weapon, they can do whatever the hell they want, and we can't stop them because things might get out of hand. You can't operate that way. I'm sorry, you just can't.
The problem is with that. I mean, I agree with you, and I can still I can see an example in my head already of just a country that contradicts that a little bit. Is like North Korea. It is nuclear armed, or it's becoming nuclear armed with ICBMs, and it does sort of, and it is sort of getting away with a lot of things. Obviously, it's not doing much to it's not doing anything that serious to its neighbours at this time. But one worries that when North Korea kind of develops the ICBM capability where it could strike the heart of Washington or wherever, that they might start getting a bit bolder, and maybe they will do an artillery strike on South Korea one day and just move on in, and then it creates that situation of what happens next. Can one fight that? I don't know. This is the weird nuclear brinkmanship issue, isn't it? I mean, and again, like if Russia had been more successful in its war against Ukraine, once it could have grabbed that land, I don't think you'd ever be able to get it back. And I think it's what the Ukrainians know. This is why they're fighting tooth and nail. God bless them. This is why they're fighting so ferociously and so effectively, because their back is against the wall. And again, like what was it? There was something comment. I think there was something came out a few weeks ago or a week ago where there was a bit of hyperbole on Zelensky's side, just in private, saying kind of remarks about how we should do this and that to Russia, venting in frustration. And I don't know if you remember this, it all kind of came out a few weeks ago. And there were some people online who were like, I don't know, I think some people didn't realise that in a war, we're in Ukraine's in a war for survival, and nobody speaks perfect Queen's English during a war. People get frustrated. People get pissed off. People say stuff like, I don't know, we should just nuke Moscow now, in the heat of the moment. They don't literally mean it, but they kind of just say it to kind of get it off their chest, to vent frustration. And it was something, I can't remember what it was that Zelensky said, but I was just shocked by how many people were so naive on the internet who just don't understand that there is an actual war going on, and they could die or be wiped out tomorrow. And yet people were kind of getting all hissy about Zelensky kind of just getting pissed off and saying we should do this, that, and the other. I find it really quite mind-boggling. So back to nuclear brinkmanship and stuff. I think I do see people, and experienced people too, just sort of playing it down a bit. And we're not out of the woods with the nuclear threat yet either.
No, I mean, we've talked about this before. I think if and when Crimea comes into play, that'll be the most dangerous point.
Massively. And also, should Prigozhin, I don't know, be the man who leads some sort of anti-Putin revolution, we put it that way, or somebody else does, and Russia ends up in a kind of weird civil war, going back to those fears that the US had back in the early 90s about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And suddenly you might have opposing forces in Russia and nuclear weapons in play. And who knows? Yeah. I mean, if Prigozhin or somebody else more hardline, even more sort of extreme nationalist and anti-NATO decides, screw it, I'm going to launch a ICBM or something. It could happen. It's not out of the realms of possibility. Is it likely? Hopefully not, but it is possible. Or the worst case is, especially we're seeing with the maintenance of and training of Russian personnel, the other situation is somebody might accidentally fire one, which is probably even more likely.
You and I have talked about this. You and I were talking about this offline recently about Prigozhin. And I said something to the effect that I think that JSOC should go after the Wagner Group, at least maybe not involved directly in Ukraine, but to dismantle their operations elsewhere, like in Africa and stuff, and possibly even off Prigozhin. I think Prigozhin is a very serious destabilizing threat. Would he overthrow Putin? I don't know, but just having that kind of destabilizing influence in Russia is not good for anybody, even people who are like us, who are not fans of Putin. Instability in Moscow is not good. I think we got very lucky right at the end of the Cold War. There were no serious power struggles or sort of nuclear accidents that took place. I was this conversation in many ways sort of became the foundation for Active Measures, my series of novels. So this was over a decade ago. I was at a conference at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and there was a dinner one night, and I was at a table with a professor there who was involved in various sort of nuclear related issues for the DoD before she went to the academy. And I asked her, one of the sort of base plot elements for Active Measures is a Russian quote unquote suitcase nuke that went missing or was buried back at the end of the Cold War and then resurfaces during the novel. This was like right when I started working on it. And I asked her, about these rumors in the 90s of, various GRU defectors and stuff that came out and said that, we lost all these, small tactical nuclear weapons. And I asked her, is there any truth to that? And she said, well, they lost them and we found them.
Hey,
and that's all I can tell you.
Okay.
And from that came, I sort of just went nuts with Active Measures with that. Yeah. They lost them. We found them.
Yeah.
That's all I can tell you.
Wow.
To show you how lucky we got right at the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, bloody hell. Yeah.
So that's a story for you waiting to be told.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like, is it the Sum of All Fears with the Israeli nuclear missile that sort of was on a jet that crashes and then is found 20 years later or something? Yeah. Doomsday scenario there. It's the other. Just to finish up my sort of notes there, I mean, I'm probably repeating myself a little bit, but I'm still this post-Putin Russia, like it always bothers me, and the thing is, it's sort of what happens to Russia post the war. Last thing I think anybody needs, and this is after obviously there's been a proper due process and people responsible for the war have been tried and convicted, etc., that we've got to make sure Russia doesn't become a failed state, because I think that's dangerous too. Because if it becomes Weimar Germany, we all know what happened with that. It led to World War II. And Putinism, his sort of ideology of Putin, it's not necessarily exclusively Putin's, but he's kind of created this Russia versus NATO mentality, and ever since he came into office, that's been his strategy, and it didn't need to be that way. Now, many on the left want to point to NATO expansionism. I dismiss that now, but Putin has definitely been using NATO as a way, or this idea of a NATO threat, to embolden himself, because he's doing what a lot of, I suppose, dictators do this day. It's sort of Orwellian, isn't it? You kind of find this external threat and galvanize the people around this external threat that everybody can identify with. So for Putin, it's been NATO and the US. And obviously there's some historical, roots and stuff to some of this, but really that shit needs to stop. And I think any post Putin, post Ukraine war Russia, when it does eventually end up, hopefully, in a way, ends up in a sensible situation where it can kind of come back into the international order, they need to cut that shit out, and there needs to be some sort of process that says if there's any state TV that's pushing out propaganda, anti-Western propaganda, sanctions are back on. You know, the deal I'd give whoever the new president is, and provided not a nutcase, one of the big stipulations for me personally would be that there's no more of his anti-Western propaganda on their national television, because Russia Today, etc., just pumps out anti-Western nonsense, and it does it on a daily, hourly, probably minute-by-minute basis, and it's causing, and it's going to create Putin 2.0 unless it's nipped in the bud. So that's my my
I think I'm with you. I think that's just it's going to be a very complicated journey, you know, if and when this war ends, how you kind of address that. I mean, I think Putinism as an ideology needs to be kind of eradicated. Are we going to eradicate it by marching to Moscow, you know, the way we marched to Berlin in World War II? No, we're not going to do that. Should we, at least for history's sake, hold war criminals from this war accountable and try and convict them in absentia? Yes, we should. To have this on the record for history that this is what happened. That said, I think there's sort of this fantasy again in some circles of Twitter that like you're going to have all these Russian generals and Putin in orange jumpsuits in a courtroom in The Hague. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, would we all love to see that? Yes, we would. It's not going to happen. You know, so you need to have a realistic expectation of what accountability will look like once this is over.
Well, this is, do you know what, with that, I mean, there's a part of me, every time we bring up the war criminal thing, that kind of, I don't know, it bothers me. It brings up, should Bush and Blair be brought up for what they did with the Iraq war? I mean, you know, it's different and it's similar. And I still find, I still wrestle with this personally, because if we start bringing in Putin into The Hague, should we bring Bush and Blair in? I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's, I think before this summer is over, you know, us here in this country are going to come, we already sort of begun the process to it. I think before the summer is over, we're going to be fully in the grips of the process of holding one of our former leaders accountable for criminal acts. I mean, not war crimes, but you know, we're going to be sort of crossing the Rubicon and seeing what happens when a major, you know, nuclear superpower holds its former leaders to account for crimes that they committed while they're in office. You know, so I think that's sort of an experiment to see how that goes. I mean, should we have had more of an accountability, you know, for Iraq? I mean, whether Bush and Blair intended to mislead people going into Iraq is sort of, I don't know. I think it's kind of beyond the point at this point. Bottom line is they fucked up and they were wrong. And, you know, we lost trillions of dollars. And I mean, like 3,000 some odd Americans, but also many thousands of Iraqis, you know, so should there have been more accountability for that? I think so. I think we're kind of beyond that now. But yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about, you know, when and if and how a major world power holds its leaders to account. And I think, you know, to that point, we're about to see that in this country before the end of the summer. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Matt. No, it's going to be interesting times ahead, I think, on that front. And and obviously, you know, I've been wrestling with this mentally myself, sort of just for a while, because I feel, I don't know. I've always felt a bit hypocritical, a little bit internally, because I you know, really would love to see Putin brought to account for what he's done. But then there's a part of me that feels like, well, if we're going down that road, there are other people who need to go down that road too. So, and as much as I don't know, there's a bit of Tony Blair I quite like. I thought he was a very effective prime minister. You know, I think I sort of say nowadays he was a great prime minister except for Iraq and Afghanistan, because he did a lot of good, but his legacy has been completely ruined by his actions with Iraq.
I mean, to that same point, like what Bush did in Africa with AIDS, the whole PEPFAR initiative, absolutely incredible work just for the species.
Yeah.
You know?
I know. So it's not black and white, is it? We live in
No.
this sort of very complicated grey world, and like as we were saying earlier, in time, the international community is going to have to sort of deal with Russia again, and got to see what happens. And obviously, Zelensky had went out and tried to win over leaders who've been quite ambivalent or very pro-Russia for some time. But that's just how politics works, and I think people forget that sometimes. Not everybody likes you, and you can't always deal with everybody who likes you either. You've got to kind of find this sort of middle ground somewhere. So I think we've put the world to right with that one. So we'll move on. In the UK, there's been quite an interesting story this week that involves a former guest of this podcast, Dan Kaszeta. Bless him. He's a global expert on nerve agents, chemical weapons, and he was disinvited from speaking from a government-backed conference on chemical weapons demilitarization. And he believes it's because of his outspoken views on various issues such as the UK government's policies towards homelessness, Brexit, and asylum seekers. And Dan has extensive experience in chemical and biological and radiological weapons warfare, and he is highly sought after for his expertise, and I'm sure he would have provided a lot of value at that conference. Now, the government apparently vetted his social media content, and it obviously they saw it included his criticisms of government policies. And the Cabinet Office apparently introduced rules in 2022 where they vet potential speakers' social media accounts. But these rules have not actually been publicly published. So many of the speakers who've been vetted have never even been aware that they are being vetted, and there are rules about this.
Yeah.
And the Ministry of Defence states that it checks on speakers to ensure balanced discussions. But critics of the policy see this as a restriction of freedom of speech, and see it as a kind of no platform policy by the government aimed at its critics and opponents. Similar incidents have occurred, such as the disinvitation of a lady called Kate Devlin, who's an AI expert, and she apparently criticised government policy on social media as well. So, and obviously critics argue that unrelated political views should not affect participation in events on unrelated subjects. And just to finish up with Dan, I mean, he insisted that obviously if he were invited to this conference, which he was, he would have only spoken about his areas of expertise, because that's being a professional, and that's what professionals do, and Dan is a professional. So it's sort of getting into icky territory, this the government sort of now no platforming people because they criticised them. Well, I don't know, Matt, what your thoughts are on this.
I don't know. I mean, I've never met or spoken to Dan myself. I've been a fan of his on Twitter for a while, and he is quite outspoken. About on good issues. I know he's done he does a lot of really great volunteer work for the migrant issues that you guys had, with running laundry services for the homeless in London. Really good stuff. So if that's what you're, I don't know, if that's his activities that you're taking issue with, I think that says more about you than him. To that point, though, I think it's a loss for the conversation, for these dialogues that the British government is attempting to have at these conferences. If I don't know, the only people you're going to have there are like, I don't know, Suella Braverman fanboys, or people who were at that National Conservative conference in Bournemouth recently. I don't know. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think it shows a level of insecurity on behalf of the Cabinet Office, that they have to sort of like shield themselves off from people who have dissenting views that aren't even in the fields that the conference is going to be about. Like to your point, Dan's not going to come there to talk about the migrant crisis or homelessness in London. That's not what he's an expert in. That's not what he's there for. It's unfortunate.
It is. I think it's a real, it's the beginning of a threat to free speech in many ways, isn't it? Because people now who, people who may have sensible, critical views of government policy are going to be much more reluctant to express their views online now, because they're worried it's going to have a knock-on effect on their profession. Because I think I don't know in Dan's case, but there are people out there who go to these conferences and it sort of helps them professionally. And they may even get a fee from it. I think Dan waived his fee, if I remember the Newsnight interview correctly. But the thing is, as well, is then being blacklisted by the UK government professionally can be seen as a bit of a mark against you as well.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it has a much bigger effect on people's individual careers than we probably even realise. And I don't think it's good. And it's getting into this sort of Soviet Russia territory, as Dan called it. It's Stalinist, you know. Now we're not able to sort of talk about what's going wrong, you know, whatever happened to truth to power. I can understand banning individuals who support terrorism and those who who express views about forcibly disposing the government by undemocratic means and kind of mean it seriously, like the January 6 attacks. And there's been a quite sketchy history in the UK at universities and even some government events where people who openly support Al-Qaeda online have ended up speaking at events in front of students and in front of the government and so on. And there's been a real blind spot in that over the years has got a bit better, but in some cases at certain universities that's still an issue. And I also find it slightly ironic that it's sort of a right-wing government and supporters of the right-wing supporters of the Conservative Party who love to accuse the left of blacklisting and no platforming and cancelling people.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't that cancel culture?
Yeah, they're the ones doing the cancelling. You know, it's quite ironic there. And all you have to do is look at all the sort of anti-woke and anti-trans hysteria online is to get a taste of how right-wing pundits do love to cancel or dehumanise people who hold different political views. So it's rather complicated. And also this policy came about from last year when a right-wing online publication called Guido Fawkes, there was a speaker at some government event, I think it was at the sort of part of the Black Lives Matter Black History Month event that the government were holding last year. And some of the speakers were called out for their anti-Boris Johnson views and their anti-Tory government views. And you know, some of them could have called the Prime Minister a buffoon, etc. But they weren't there to say those sort of things. So it kind of came about from this sort of ongoing kind of culture wars. And it kind of gets again into this sort of grey, icky territory that even I have no idea how to completely navigate. My view has always been, I think, you know, people who openly want to destroy the government are a problem.
Yeah.
People let off steam on the internet. Maybe people shouldn't let off steam so much on the internet. Well, they, at least if they're going to criticize government policy, need to sort of do it in a what's the word? Professional way. I don't know if it's the right word, but you know what I mean? He needs to do it in a kind of considered. Maybe people need to stop letting off steam and need to write more considered prose that criticises government. So rather than saying Boris Johnson is whatever, maybe it's better just to state the facts of where Boris Johnson's policies and decisions are bad, rather than adding a judgment to it where you then say, you know, he's a privileged tosspot who doesn't give a shit about people, for example. So and that doesn't necessarily reflect my views, by the way. But so yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Online discourse is hard to navigate, and it can mess up your career.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to lead into a level of groupthink if the only people that, you know, Downing Street and Whitehall want to hear from are people who are completely ideologically in lockstep with the Tories. You know, it lessens the amount of people that you're going to hear from. And that's not to make the point that, like, you know, how do you know that Nazis are bad if you haven't been to a Nuremberg rally? I mean, that's a very stupid argument that I'm not trying to go into that level. But I think most reasonable people would be able to determine, you know, what kind of speech a person makes online is appropriate or not to have them speak at a government conference that has nothing to do with what they said online. It's sort of it's I can't give you like a solid example right now, but it's one of those things that, like, people know it when they see it, that, you know, that's not good for you to be there. Speaking out in favor of migrants and the housing crisis is not one of them.
No, exactly. It's again, like, it is ironic. Like, the debates I've had with people about free speech versus hate speech, generally the right-wing people who end up chatting with about this always bring up, well, freedom of speech is all about, like, being able to debate ideas, etc. And so, yeah, so they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot with this supposed, like, it's about debating ideas, because if you can't have people who have opposing views at your conference or whatever, then it is a bit problematic. But there is a fine line between what I think is hate speech and what's freedom of speech. If you start dehumanizing people who look different to you, that's getting into hate speech. If you have an issue, I don't know. Again, it's very difficult to kind of make an example, isn't it? Because it's just, as you said, you kind of know it when you see it. So yeah, I think it's quite tricky to navigate, but in some ways there is simplicity to it as well.
Well, I think a lot of people on the right, and sort of that sort of libertarian techie kind of sphere, fundamentally misunderstand, and I think some people do it intentionally from a bad faith place, distort the idea of what free speech is. So at least, the First Amendment means that the government can't prosecute you for something that you say. And even you can say a lot of hate speech in this country, can't be prosecuted for it. That's what the First Amendment does. The First Amendment doesn't mean that you can say whatever the hell you want without criticism or consequences. The First Amendment also protects people's right to not want to associate with you because of the crazy offensive shit that you say. The First Amendment does not give you protection to say whatever you want and not be criticized for it. That's not what it is. It's so the government can't prosecute you for it.
Yeah, definitely. And one other point, actually, people forget that Twitter, Facebook, etc. are privately owned platforms, and you do not have a God-given right to say what you like on those platforms, because the corporation...
First Amendment doesn't apply to them.
No, it doesn't. The corporation, in a sense, is just allowing you to say what you like, but it can change its mind at any moment and say, no more.
And the good thing about a capitalist society is that, okay, if there's some private tech platform that doesn't allow you to say something on this platform, you're free to go make your own platform to say what you want on it, which plenty of people on the right have done because they weren't able to say it on Twitter.
Well, now they can say it on Twitter. So.
Now they can. Now comedy is legal again on Twitter, and you can announce your presidential campaign and it'll crash. And burn
my goodness. Yeah. Poor old Twitter. But that's
another
that's another debate. Thing. Maybe for extra shot later. Who knows? But, so look, I'll quickly wrap up on the Turkish election just because we touched upon it in the last episode. So there's another presidential runoff happening in Turkey this weekend. Guys, almost like deja vu this. So on the 28th of May, there'll be another election in Turkey to decide whether President Erdogan will continue as president or whether it will be Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, head of the opposition. So Kılıçdaroğlu has accused Russia of interfering in the previous election that happened on the 14th of May. And apparently Russia created a deepfake video and used false material and created a sex tape that involved another candidate in the election, Muharrem İnce. And he was allegedly kind of filmed performing a sex act with someone, and he then had to withdraw from the race. And a spokesperson for the Kremlin has denied any allegations of election interference, but we do know that Russia's favorite hobby is election interference. So election interference is a big deal with Russia, and we've seen it quite a lot since 2016. So frankly, I wouldn't put it past the Russian government to be somehow behind this. And with AI technology, etc., you can now create deepfakes that could put you in all sorts of compromising situations. And also now that can provide a great defense for people who do participate in awkward and compromising things too. So we're getting into a very interesting place now. So current polls indicate that it's going to be a close presidential election, and the candidates need over 50% of the vote to outright win. Erdogan wants to send a message to the West for this election, and his interior minister even went further, saying that the previous vote on the 14th of May was a political coup by the West. So you can kind of see some interesting things going on there. Kılıçdaroğlu's campaign is campaigning for reform and dismantling of Erdogan's authoritarian regime. He also is proposing a sort of different foreign policy. policy that may or may not sort of affect relations with Russia. And so I think Russia want Erdogan to hold on to power if they are interfering with the opposition. And it's interesting as well that Russia are so bold in that, because obviously if Kılıçdaroğlu does win, that does create a very awkward situation for Turkish-Russian relations with the new president. And so, Matt, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, Erdogan's another one of those sort of authoritarian-ish figures like Mohammed bin Salman, who's been playing a kind of middle ground, unhelpful middle ground between the West and Russia, China, that kind of authoritarian axis. It does seem the runoff election is coming up on, it's on Sunday. So the day after this podcast comes out, it does seem like Erdogan will win again, and I mean, honestly, probably be in office for the rest of his life if we're being honest.
I suspect you're right there.
Not the outcome I would have wanted. Yeah, I mean, so Erdogan got just shy under 50% of the vote in the first round of the elections. You have to get over 50% to avoid a runoff. So just narrowly missed not having that. The third place candidate recently, I've out of the race because the runoff endorsed Erdogan. It seems like he'll pull it out. But to your point here about these AI powered deepfake videos, this is something that we're going to have to grapple with repeatedly. I bet we'll see something to that effect here in the 2024 election in the US. How serious, what impact it'll have, I don't know, but I would bet money that you'll see it, something like that. I think it doesn't help that broadly across the board, like we're not just talking about like third world countries that aren't quite, you would say, sophisticated, I guess, that would believe this stuff. I think you would have widespread belief of a deepfake video here in the US, even just because it conveniently fits a narrative that a large segment of the population wants to believe. Like, let's say, okay, in the 2016 election, the Access Hollywood tape of Trump saying, if you're a star, you can grab him by the what. Nowadays, he could just come out and say, deepfake, not real. They made it up. And there's a huge segment of the population that, because it's convenient for them to believe that, they'll just believe it and go back into their corners, and that's it. That's the end of it. That's a huge problem with this AI technology and its ability to just fuck with issues internationally. It's that you can make these videos that can destabilize things, but the ability to, you said in the intro, for bad actors who are caught doing nefarious, not nice, good things, to just say, oh, it's a deepfake, whatever, and just dismiss it. To that point, fairly soon, I'm going to be recording an interview for this podcast with a friend of mine who's a bit of an expert in AI to talk about all of these scary dystopian issues.
Brilliant. Well, this is it. AI has been, I think, on everybody's mind for some time now. It's certainly been on mine a bit this year. It's weird. It's since about February. All I've been thinking about, well, it's not all I've been thinking about, but it's been on my mind a lot. AI. It's been a massive shift, and I can't. Why did it happen in February? What happened? Was it just
ChatGPT came out?
Did it?
Yeah,
was it
that came out to public use, and everyone was like, "Oh crap."
Yeah, and it's just mad. I even went on a screenwriting course about how to use it kind of sensibly, because obviously there are people out there who could use it to sort of generate something from scratch. But I can tell you now that most of the stuff you generate from scratch is pretty awful.
It's bad.
It requires an awful lot of work, and by the time, you might as well have written it yourself by the time, So it's,
this is also outside the scope of this podcast, but I mean, that AI question is also right now right at the heart of the Writers Guild strike in Hollywood. And also, if the Screen Actors Guild goes on strike soon, I mean, they're going to have the vote to authorize the strike fairly soon. The same issues will be right at the center of that, regulating this stuff and figuring out a way to distinguish what is real and what's not, either in entertainment or in news. I don't know how we sort those things out, but that's something I would like to talk about when that friend of mine comes on soon.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. Well, look, Matt, we're going to wrap up Espresso Martini here. So, thank you everybody for listening on Espresso Martini. We will be continuing on Extra Shot. So you can join us now if you go to patreon.com/Espresso patreon.com/secrets and spies. And if you become a subscriber, you can access us on Extra Shot. And we're going to be continuing on with stories that we haven't covered. And in fact, there's a Mossad spy ring that may have been wrapped up in Turkey that we'll probably have a quick chat about.
Ooh.
So we'll catch you on the other side. Matt, where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
I'm on Twitter at Fulton Matt, and then my website, which is mattfulton.net, has the novels and all that good stuff on there. You can find that.
Excellent. And everybody, thank you very much for listening. Please do consider leaving a review, because all reviews help boost our algorithm and help other people find the show. If you want to get access to our Extra Shot, please become a Patreon subscriber. And thank you again for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.